Welcome everyone to this great talk with Patrick Taran on a very interesting topic that was already a hot topic even before COVID-19. And the title he chose is Migrants and Migration Under COVID-19, Demise of Solidarity, Failure of the International Community. Many of us, we know Patrick for many, many years, but many don't. So Patrick Taran is president of Global Migration Policy Associates since 2011. He was senior migration specialist at the ILO from 2000 to 2011 and secretary for the migration at the World Council of Churches from 1990 to 1998. He co-founded and directed the South American Refugee Resettlement Program in Seattle from 1996 to 1980. He was co-founder of the Committee for U.S. Action on Asylum Concerns in 1985, Migrant Rights International in 1994, the Global Ecumenical Network on Refugees and Migration in 1995, and the Steering Committee for the Global Campaign on the Migrant Rights Conventions in 1998. Patrick is a globally recognized specialist on international migration, focused on migration governance and protection of migrants, with 45 years of full-time professional operational experience in migration, immigration, refugees resettlement, and discrimination integration, as well as development, human rights, social work, and health at local, national, and global levels. Thank you very much for being with us, Patrick. Manuela Tortora, our Vice President in Grace Sales, will conduct the session, and she will organize all the questions and give the floor to the different participants. Thank you very much. And Manuela, would you like to explain us a little bit how the session will be conducted?
Yes, very quickly. So you have a column that is called the chat. You can open it with the icon at the bottom of your screen. And just organize a little bit the conversation to avoid crossing comments and questions. Please write your question or comment here on the column, and I will try to manage according to the topic or the sequence that is more appropriate. But then it's of course up to our speaker to decide how to proceed with the answers. In any case, since we have a small group for the time being, we can also give the floor, if we can, to each one of the participants for questions. And then you have the floor, Patrick. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Manuela, and thank you, Alejandro, for that generous introduction. As Alejandro has noted, I chose the title of Migrants and Migration Under COVID-19, Demise of Solidarity, Failure of International Community, to underline, I think, the huge challenges that the world faces as part of both the consequences and the responses that many governments and other actors have taken to migrants and migration. The third piece of what I want to talk about is, building on that, is to talk about what I see as a potentially impending catastrophe at the world level as a result of what's been happening to migrants and migration. I say that because, first of all, much of the world's produce is dependent on migrant labor around the world for its production, distribution. Much of the world's meat and other food products are likewise dependent on migrant labor, for example, for meat, chicken, beef, and other meat processing. Fishing and fish are similar. And the challenge we face just in that area is the fact that with borders closed and a sense of that migrants have to go home, in a whole number of countries around the world, what we're seeing is the disappearance or the non-arrival of migrant labor that's needed to grow the world's food and produce the world's meat and so on, which will have consequences in the very near future. First of all, what I want to note is that, just to give a few examples, about 300,000 migrant workers are what makes Canadian farming and Canadian meat processing work. About 18,000 migrant workers come into Switzerland every year during the growing season. And already a few weeks ago, Canadian growers and even the lobster industry were complaining that the workers weren't arriving to be there for the planting and the initial agricultural growing season. And similarly, the lobster packing season couldn't even start because there weren't the people either to staff the plants or to work on the boats. That's just one example, but to give you an idea, to give us an idea of what we're talking about, Kazakhstan, which is in part an agricultural country, depends on about 1 million workers coming every year from neighboring Tajikistan and Kyrgyz Republic. Argentina depends on hundreds of thousands of workers coming during the growing season from Paraguay, Chile, and Bolivia in particular, some from Peru, Uruguay. The United States, in addition to having a huge domestic migrant worker population, agricultural migrant worker population, also depends on a lot of people who come from Central America and Mexico to staff the meat packing plants throughout the Midwest and chicken packing plants on the East Coast and so on. That's just a little bit of a sense, but in a bigger sense, my understanding is that we're talking about at least 10 million workers around the world who are migrant workers in agriculture, who are generally by and large seasonal workers. And we're seeing with closing borders everywhere, including, again, what people don't know about is there are somewhere between 80,000 and 300,000 Ethiopian workers who go to run the farms in neighboring Sudan. And again, with borders closed, as far as I have seen, they're not moving. All of that is simply to give you an introduction to what's behind what's happening and what's behind the risks of what's happening. To say about what's happening in terms of talking about the demise of solidarity in a broad sense, what we're seeing and have seen generally with migrant workers around the world is arbitrary and immediate dismissal from work, from the Middle East to Europe to North America. We've seen at the same time retaining migrant workers in particularly essential sectors like health, but without any kind of adequate protection, the PPE, the personal protective equipment, and so on. And as a result, for example, Somali migrants in the UK, who are an important community there, have suffered particularly high fatality rates because many of them were in health work and got infected before the proper measures were taken. And even today, the complaint is, if you look at what's happened in meatpacking plants in Canada and the United States, a lot of migrant workers have been and are continuing to be infected by COVID. A third area, of course, that's a huge challenge worldwide is expulsion and deportation of migrants from the territories where they are. And at the same time, people who are migrants, particularly from Western countries, being encouraged and even assisted to go home, but leaving countries where they're working without the skills and the labor that they were providing to make those economies run. But to give an example of how serious the challenge is for some countries, the latest figures I just saw from London School of Economics speak of 40% of all families in Somalia depending on earnings and remittances from migrant workers abroad. And the figures are that the estimate of remittances to Somalia are about 1.6 to $2 billion worth per year in a country whose entire GDP is about 6 billion a year. And recent estimates by at least one of the, shall we say, remittance operators is that in some remittance corridors, the remittances to Somalia have declined by 50%. And if you look at 40% of the population or 40% of the households being in part or wholly dependent on remittances, you can see just one aspect of what may be a catastrophe that's emerging. Alongside of that, and again, looking at the demise of solidarity and the risks that that's posing, is the situation where many countries have been reducing food exports precisely in case there is a drop in food production and a drop in international supply chains. But the result is that many countries that are dependent or highly dependent, at least in part, on their food supplies are facing situations that have already emerged in Lebanon. Lebanon is dependent for about 30% of its entire food consumption on imports. Those imports have been significantly reduced. And of course, the migrant labor to do what farming is being done in Lebanon are further and farther between, so to speak, with a result that already 2 weeks ago, Lebanon declared a national food emergency. Let me step back, having said that, and speak about what is often not recognized, even in the discourse of international organizations, and certainly not in public discourse, which is the already high dependence of most Western industrialized countries' economies on immigrants, immigrant labor, and the labor and skills of the children of immigrants. To give you an idea of the proportions and the importance, I can just cite what former mayor of the biggest city in the UK said a few years ago, which is that London wouldn't make it to breakfast without migrants. Looking at the quintessentially Austrian city of Vienna, if you scratch the surface and look at the figures, 50% of the Vienna population is either foreign-born or has at least one parent who's foreign-born. And in fact, when you look at many of the major European cities, from London to Paris to Brussels and so on, you see high proportions of populations that reflect recent immigration and similar proportions in the workforce. A good example of both migration and the proportion of dependence on immigration for the workforce is Germany, which has about 15% of its population being foreign-born, but 19.5, almost 20% of the German workforce is made up of foreign-born people. And that's not including children of foreign-born. When you start looking at the descendants of recent immigration, you're talking about an even bigger percentage. Switzerland, our host country here, is another example that I already referred to. About 30% of the Swiss workforce, by official figures, is foreign-born. That's to say immigrant, and that's to say in international lexicon, migrants. And here I just mentioned for reference that the UN definition of migrant is essentially, or international migrant I should say, is a person who is living in another country than that of birth or citizenship for at least a year. The global figure that the UN data cites is that there are now 374 million, I think the figure is, international migrants, which represents just over 3% of the world population, and which in proportion to the world population is a slight increase to what it's been over the last 50 or 60 years, which is pretty constant at 3% of the global population. So again, here in the terms we're using, we need to be very careful about, which is to say that, yes, there's an increase in migration internationally, but it's not any significantly more than the increase in world population. It's being proportional, and yet what we're seeing now is an acceleration of the participation of migrants in workforces worldwide. And that's, I would say, a matter of at least 3 different factors. One, first of all, for most Western countries and almost for about half of the world's countries, it's a matter of substitution for aging populations and declining workforces. Again, a good example is that the official calculation for Germany is that between 2015 and 2030, it loses about 6 million members of its workforce. Italy, about 3 million over that period. And that's essentially the consequence of the declining fertility rates, declining births, and increasing numbers of people both living longer but leaving the workforce, and reducing the number of people of working age who are in the workforce. What all of this adds up to, I come back to repeat, is a huge dependence on migration and on immigrant or temporary migrant labor to run entire sectors of the economies of many Western countries, and in countries elsewhere around the world, including in developing countries. I cited earlier the numbers of hundreds of thousands of Ethiopian workers who provide labor for Sudanese agriculture. You look at Burkina Faso, where a quarter of the entire population are descendants of migrants from neighboring countries who basically established, built up, and run the major export industry of Côte d'Ivoire, which is Ivory Coast, which is cocoa production. More specifically, what has also been underlined and is also seen in one of the huge challenges that the world is facing with healthcare, particularly in this COVID pandemic, is the fact that in many countries, particularly Western countries, a significant proportion of healthcare workers and the people who provide care to aged people are in fact migrants and immigrants. And that we're not only facing serious consequences, immediate consequences of the situation with COVID-19 and the response measures that have been put in place that have made it difficult for health workers even to remain healthy, particularly those coming from immigrant and migrant backgrounds. But also, I think the figures from Public Services International suggest that we're looking at an unfilled or unfillable shortage, I think, of something like 6 million nurses by 2025 around the world. And that shortage isn't going to be filled at this rate because the training isn't being done. And worse, in developed countries where the existing workforce, including in health, is to some extent also aging, the replacement isn't in sight for those health workers. I come back then to the question of the demise of solidarity and the failure of the international community. I think most striking about the response, the generalized global response to COVID and the COVID crisis has been, on the one hand, identifying and scapegoating migrants as the vectors or transmitters of COVID, making no distinction between travelers and migrants, many of us who have been where we are for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. However, the almost universal response has been basically to say, migrants go home, we don't need you, we don't want you, and we can do without you. And already in, for example, the Canadian discourse around the fact that the migrant workers aren't coming, some people say, well, why don't Canadians go do that work? Well, there are several reasons why native populations can't and don't do that work. Not only the fact that I'm not sure many people who are urbanized and in cities and have some expectations of a decent work life and social protection want to say, okay, we're going to go back to the farm, we're going to work for $3 an hour picking strawberries or work under backbreaking 10-hour, 12-hour days under hot sun in the summer and sprayed by pesticides and so on. Secondly, regardless of what the image is, a lot of agricultural work, including even things like picking strawberries or tending tomato fields, is not skilled, unskilled work. It takes a lot of skill to actually be able to pick tomatoes and pack them properly so they get to market in an edible condition. And it tends to be migrant workers who come from other areas that both have the willingness and, in fact, the necessity to work for relatively low wages to maintain food prices affordable for populations even in Western countries. But many of them also have developed over time particular skills. If you look again at the migration or migrant worker population, the temporary migrant worker population that I spoke of in Canada, many of them are people who come year after year for 10, 20 years and have developed skills and experience that Canadians don't have, and that you can't just tell people from the city to go out in the fields and do that. So again, this idea that we don't need them is frankly against the economic and social realities, but furthermore adds up to an attitude of, well, we can just get rid of them and it's no problem. There's no need to take care of them. There's no need to keep them around and keep them employed. The reality is, when they're gone, they're gone. And right now, those Central American and Caribbean pickers going into Canada cannot get across the Mexican border in the buses that they usually take to get to the Canadian border, to then go to the agricultural regions from Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, etc. Similarly, other areas of the economy are highly dependent in many countries on migrant labor that's suddenly either not there or disappearing. In fact, the dependence in areas of construction, in areas of services, I already mentioned healthcare and agriculture, and increasingly in high-tech work, for example, IT, is also increasingly in many countries dependent on immigrant and labor. I mean, if one looks at Silicon Valley in the US, a large proportion of the workers there are actually, shall we say, made in India, trained in the excellent schools around Mumbai and elsewhere that have made India one of the world's premium, shall we say, sources of highly skilled people in ICT or IT. Then, speaking of the failure of the international community, in this sense of, in some cases, abysmal treatment of migrant workers. I put that in the title because what I've seen to date is a frankly not abysmal, but totally inadequate response on the part of the international community, and particularly the international organizations, including in the UN system. And I would say three things underpin that assessment. First of all, 4 months after, 5 months almost after the outbreak of COVID and its rapid spread, there is still no serious technical guidance produced by international organizations to suggest how governments in, for example, African countries or Latin American countries, let alone European countries, should deal with COVID and migration. And I was told, I've been doing recently some work in the IGAD region, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development of the Horn of Africa countries. And I was told that some of the government officials there, in the absence of any kind of serious technical international guidance, had gone to looking at doing Google searches to say, what do we do about, how do we, for example, set up testing at airports for the migrant workers being returned involuntarily, and in some cases COVID positive, from Middle Eastern countries. Or in the case of the Americas, the now rather infamous series of returns of Guatemalan migrants from detention centers in the United States directly to Guatemala City, coming back with a significant number or proportion of them being COVID positive. It's not just a matter of what the international organizations have done, which is to remind people of the normative and ethical principles of application of human rights, equality of treatment, inclusion. What is also needed is clear technical guidance, the same kind of guidance that comes out in 100 or 200 page manuals from, for example, UNAIDS on how to deal with HIV and AIDS at a national and even a local level. All the complex technical, medical, and scientific information that one needs to make and do the proper in specific steps. I think a second concern in terms of the lack of authoritative response from international organizations in particular, and what I would say a failure of community, is an inability to even say that what some countries are doing is wrong. And by that I mean, when I read that in several Middle Eastern countries, the response to COVID and large migrant population has been, and I think this was the term they used, sealing off migrant residential areas and sealing off industrial areas where where migrant workers may be living close to the sites they're working at. Sealing off neighborhoods. The analogy that comes to my mind when I hear that term is Warsaw in 1941, when the German occupation authorities decided they would seal off the Jewish ghetto. You all know what some of the indirect and direct consequences of that were. But what we've already heard in terms of some of the migrant workers in Middle Eastern countries and elsewhere is that those sealed off neighborhoods are not getting food delivered. They have no access to medical care. People are getting sick, not only of COVID or whatever, due to the already existing poor conditions. And they're being left as if they were in a sealed off ghetto. And to my mind, the fact that the international community has not been able to say that is wrong. And that is not only violating human rights, it's killing people. An analogy is that many of the recommendations for COVID protection and public health involve isolation and involve separation, non-contact. The challenge is those measures may be applicable in Western northern cities and countries, but they simply cannot work in ghettos, favelas, whatever, where you have thousands of people living in crowded housing or practically no decent housing at all, and where, because in Africa as an average, 85% of employment is in the informal sector, it's day-to-day work, and if you don't go out and work and sell something on the corner or work in a field and get a day pay, you don't come home either with money or with food. To the extent that I heard on several occasions stories coming out of some countries, not only in Africa, people saying, we're not afraid of COVID, we're going to die of hunger first. Under, obviously, those lockdown measures. And that leads me, in a sense, to the third concern with the international community is that and that's also the concern with the response of many governments, which is saying, we're even going to compete with other countries and take the personal protective equipment and the ventilators and so on that somebody else, some other country was buying from China, and we're going to capture that or pay the pilot of the airplane to bring it to somewhere else instead. The sense of everybody seeing, we do it on our own, we don't expect, and the international organizations don't have the capacity, because they're driven by their member governments, have the capacity to say, no, we need to do what is now the big question, for example, in the development of the COVID vaccine. Is it going to be monopolized, shall we say, by the first or second or third Western developed country that can develop it? Or is it going to be developed and distributed in a way that is equal access around the world? Again, this comes back to the sense of failure of internationalism, failure of solidarity, and failure of the institutions themselves to push ahead and say some of the measures that are being taken are simply wrong. Some of the measures, and many of the measures, in fact, are hurting people. And the third point that I kind of want to bring my initial discussion presentation to a close with is to say, what are the consequences of this? I think the consequences may be three huge problems of a global level. And I said catastrophe at the beginning, maybe, I hope, not a full catastrophe, but certainly three crises. One, and first of all, immediately, is that the skills and labor power in a number of economies, simply to keep those economies going, is disappearing, and when it needs to come in on a temporary basis or on a seasonal basis, it's not coming in. Secondly, the skills, the innovation, the labor power, and so on, that will be absolutely essential to an economic recovery, which would, of course, support social recovery and a restoration of some level of minimal welfare for populations, simply ain't going to happen when large portions of the people who need to be in those economic situations, in those cities, in those countries, in those companies, in those operations, industrial, commercial, agricultural, whatever, aren't there and aren't going to be able to get there and aren't getting there now. Although I note that a few countries have been very astute. For example, Switzerland, that recognized its dependence on labor from across the border here and from Eastern Europe for agriculture, did a couple of things that didn't hit the headlines. One, the borders actually weren't closed with France. Anyone who was an essential worker who lived in France, who needed to work in Geneva or Basel or elsewhere, got a little sticker for their car and they could just go right through in the morning to their job and back home in the evening. Secondly, I understand that arrangements have been made for buses from Poland, from Bulgaria, from Romania and elsewhere to bring people through closed borders across Europe to Switzerland to make sure that the agricultural work would be done despite closed borders. The understanding, at least of a few countries and authorities, superseded a little bit the absolute lack of solidarity, as I term it, to make sure that where essential workers are needed and needed from outside and needed for agriculture and so on, we're getting there. That's not necessarily been the case elsewhere, and there have been debates even in the European press because agriculture in Italy, in Greece, in France, southern France, Bouches du Rhône region, agriculture in Germany, agriculture in Switzerland, you name it, and including the UK, is significantly dependent on seasonal foreign workers from elsewhere in Europe and abroad. The challenge at the end, and the third challenge that I think may be the most concerning, as I say, we don't see the measures being put to make sure people who will be the basis of recovery are getting to their recovery. The bigger basis, though, is what's going to happen in this fall and this winter, when the food production levels of Western countries, as well as others, is significantly reduced from what it usually is, because the migrant workers were not there in the planting season and are not there now in the numbers they normally are to assure normal levels of production. Right now, it's not such a problem because there are food reserves and there have been food stocks and there is some production that's still going on. But I'm not sure, and I don't see any data and I don't see the research yet trying to really calculate this out, except in a few offices of public policy planners and economic planners who say, now wait a minute, we have a problem here. For another two regions of the world, I think another challenge intersects that's even makes the situation more dramatic. I'm sure some of you have been following the explosive expansion of locust plagues that have now virtually destroyed agricultural production this year in most of East Africa. That's to say Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia. And where the locust plague since the end of last year has been devastating large areas of agricultural production in Pakistan, and where the recent readings I have is that while there have been usual outbreaks of locusts in certain remote parts of India, already the locusts have been spreading across major areas of India's agricultural production. If you combine that for those areas of the world with the challenges we see elsewhere, and there too with the demise of solidarity, the disappearance of migrant workers, I think there may be some cause for concern in not such a distant future. I think I leave it at that because that's, I think, my provocative conclusion, to say the lack of solidarity and the failure of community is not just a moral and, if you will, ethical or human rights failure or human rights absence. It's a failure that can, and I think very likely will, have huge economic consequences that will affect the very ability of many of us in this world to eat over the next year or two. I leave it at that, and I think a good point to welcome questions, comments, discussion, and so on.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for a very comprehensive introduction. which is in fact a little bit more than an introduction and a provocation.
Manuela, your microphone? She's okay.
Yes,
she's okay.
my microphone
Okay.
is on, yes. I was saying that your introduction is much more than an introduction. It is an alert to everybody, and particularly to the policymakers of not only the national level, but the international level. Again, we are seeing in this great talk that we are revolving around the topic of a crisis of multilateralism in very practical terms, not only in academic terms, but with political and economic consequences that are accelerated because of the pandemic. The floor is open for questions or comments. As I said, if possible, write it on the column of chat with just keywords or short sentences so that it's easier to manage. But in the meanwhile, while you think about your own concerns, Alejandro already flagged a very important one, which is regarding the role of remittances that you mentioned in your introduction. So migration is good for developed economies because of the dependency that you just mentioned, but it also has some relatively good consequences from the remittances side for the countries of origin. Now, we know that overall, on average, in the least developed countries, remittances represent around 15 to 20% of GDP. In some countries, much more than that for the poorest countries. But this issue is always a little bit separated from the migration policies. I mean, I do not see in the public opinion, in the media, in the general debate, the linkages between remittances, development, and migration policies. Can you probably share with us your thinking on that?
Thank you, Manuela. That's in fact a very good question and allows me to say a little bit more of what I would have otherwise liked to have included in a presentation. Remittances are an indicator of the economic value of what migrants contribute, not only in the smaller portion that they send home to support their families and entire communities, but what they contribute to the global economy. I want to expand on that because it really relates to development, and development not only in the South, but development of or maintaining development in developed countries. The best estimates by the World Bank are that about $600 billion worth of remittances are sent home both to North and South countries. Remembering, for example, that in Europe, half of all the migrants in Europe are from half of all of the migrants in European Union member countries are from other EU member countries, and they send remittances back to their countries. How many of you would have guessed that France receives about $46 billion a year in remittances? And the amount that Germany receives is not so far behind that. To give a global sense of what I'm trying to convey, $600 billion per year represents about, at most, 20% of migrant take-home pay and benefits. If you multiply that by 5 to get a value of what migrants' total take-home pay and benefits are as an economic value, you come up with a figure of about $3 trillion, not billion, but $3 trillion worth of migrant skills and labor contribution to economies where they are, measured or represented by what they get in their take-home pay. To give you a comparison, $3 trillion is greater than the total annual global value of international trade in petroleum products, gas, and derivatives. So we're talking big bucks, and we're talking about a huge economic contribution if you choose to measure it in the value of migrants' pay, which is remuneration for what they're contributing in skills and labor to the economies where they are and to the particular enterprises where they're working. So you're talking a big amount. And again, 4/5 of what migrants earn stay in the country where they're working. The counterpoint, and coming back, Manuela, to your specific question, migrant remittances, as I mentioned in Somalia's case, not only represent a big piece of GDP, but they represent a big piece, or if not, in some cases, the whole piece of what households bring in order to survive. Not even to thrive, just to survive. 40% of households in Somalia, for example. If you look at countries like Tajikistan or Bangladesh or even Pakistan or Philippines, I can name countries around the world. You can also name countries in the Americas for that matter. You're looking at the fact that remittances provide a big, may not be huge in terms of GDP, but a big piece of what sustains and provides social protection in a de facto sense for many people. The crisis we're seeing is that World Bank already issued in April an estimate that the decline this year in global remittance flows would be 20%. Over $100 billion less of resources that people depend on for survival and community sustenance going to countries where people depend on it. But that seems now to be, in some cases, a significant underestimate of what's happening. I mentioned already that in some corridors of remittances, again to use Somalia because I'm working on some research on it right now, observers saying half, 50% decline in remittances going there. I've heard figures now for a couple of Southeast Asian countries of I think Sri Lanka already seeing 30% reduction in the remittances that have actually been coming since April. And the impact there is double. Okay, we can look at it in broad economic terms, but what happens when the household income goes from $300 a month to 0 per month? And with no employment, not even the ability to get out of your house to do local informal work. I think we got a big problem here, and it's already now. It's not at the end of the year. And again, to tail up, Manuela, on the question of development in remittances, I just want to add that research shows that most remittances are spent in 4 areas: housing, nutrition, education, and healthcare. And that while they can be attributed by economists to personal consumption, they in fact are consumption and expenditures that build health clinics in local communities that don't have them, that provide for schools where they weren't there before and paying teachers' salaries, that provide for building houses, that actually instigate construction companies to start up and build housing, even if it's not even if it's not at the level of a modern Western city. And nutrition means that children in those communities grow up not malnourished like those who don't have relatives abroad, but grow up with an increase in what we can again use an economic term, human capital. You grow up with people who have the schooling, they can finish school, they're reasonably healthy and so on, so those children actually can then enter the labor market at home or abroad with a reasonable chance, at least before COVID, a reasonable chance of being able to earn some kind of living and supporting in turn their families.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. Indeed, the issue of the remittances has many angles and is a complex one. In the meanwhile, Catherine had a question regarding the opening of the EU borders. So going back to the European dimension, what is the effect of the opening of the EU borders now or in the next few weeks or months, as soon as the lockdown is totally lifted?
Well, let me clarify first that the borders that have been opened are Schengen borders among the Schengen countries, not all of the EU countries. And secondly, I think the effect of those borders being opened and border controls being rescinded is clearly going to have an immediate effect on starting some or restarting economic activity, from basic restaurants to making it easier for people to go across to buy products that aren't available locally, to restarting or a normalization of both production and distribution, at least among the goods and services that are produced among Schengen countries. And even, let me note, and this is because this has also been a big issue in terms of borders in Africa and elsewhere. Even if a border remained open to commercial transportation, as between France and Spain, for example, there is an economic impact and a cost to when you're shipping fresh vegetables or live animals, to having your truck have to wait 6 or 12 hours before it can be inspected and you can cross the border. And that raises the cost, it raises the mortality of animal shipments. For meat, it raises the deterioration rate for fresh vegetables and so on. So I just step back to say that, of course, at least among Schengen countries, is also one of the advantages in terms of coming back to the point of food supply and shipping what people need to live on. If the trucks don't have to stop, or they just stop and get a stamp and go on, which is the case here, for example, between Switzerland and France, it has also an important effect in making a little bit more fluid the restarting or the regain of function for a whole number of economic activities. The challenge, of course, is that I think, if I'm not mistaken, not even all Schengen countries are included in the lifting of border controls that happened yesterday officially. For example, the border between Spain and France is still restricted, precisely because the COVID infection rate and the measures in Spain were more dire and had to be more dire. And you even see within countries differences where we've been able to eat in restaurants and so on and go shopping without much restrictions in the part of France I live in. But only yesterday were French restaurants allowed to open and serve people inside. And again, you have these differences that note that the different COVID prevention or reduction of spread measures, even where you have the conditions to support people being relatively isolated and distancing, have economic impacts. Now restaurants can open, at least in Paris as well. So again, to step back and make the analogy with what we're talking about in terms of the specific topic of migrants, migration, and mobility, those opening borders also will enhance and make it easier for workers in non-essential jobs who live in one country to go to another. Because at least when the borders were closed between France and Switzerland, again, they were open for essential workers. But for the businesses that were closed or not considered essential, people had to stay home.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. Yes, again, an interesting aspect. Michaela is asking, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on the Global Compact implementation? There was some sort of timeline that was set at one point in time, but now with the pandemic, what will happen? What is your thought about this? And will it set us back to on the achievement of the Global Compact as a governance framework? Obviously, a non-binding governance framework.
Well, thank you for that question. And I think it allows me to expand on a related dimension to what we're talking about. In my assessment and that of some other colleagues, it was the Global Compact itself that was a serious setback to a normative, regulatory, rights-based governance of migration. The compact has essentially set aside even the notion of binding frameworks that say governments have to respect rights of migrants, they have to provide equality of treatment, they have to, if you look at other binding conventions, ensure equal treatment between men and women, including between migrant men and migrant women, and between migrant women and men of the domestic, the native population, to put it that way. I think, in fact, what is also quite evident is that almost nothing in the Global Compact provides particularly useful or immediately relevant guidance to how you deal with the intersection between a global health pandemic emergency and people who are not citizens in the countries where they may be living or working. I underline that because even the notion of having any mention of health in the Global Compact was a huge struggle. And in the end, yes, there are some nice statements, but as you say, ultimately they're non-binding. And to my mind, people don't, and governments don't necessarily obey unless there's a law to obey. And people don't necessarily do the right thing when it's economically or politically not expedient to do, unless there is a law or legislation or a national commitment to say this is what you have to do. But more generally, the whole point of international conventions and standards and a normative or rights-based approach to governance, whether we're talking migration or whether we're talking gender relations or health or whatever, is that those conventions provide agreed standards globally that say this is what you need to do for legal and ethical reasons, but almost every provision in those legal standards comes with and from an economic imperative. I mean, look at social protection, look at occupational safety and health. It's demonstrably an imperative to provide basic occupational safety and health protections in the workplace, because the actual cost to the society and to the individuals and to the companies concerned is less when you're not having lots of accidents, people out sick, and even if the company doesn't have to pay for the health care, the society does. And here again, I can make a very nice little analogy with the situation of the non-regulatory approach to migrants and migration. When statistics were kept in the European Union, non-citizen workers in workplaces at whatever sector you looked at had occupational injury and death rates twice the level of citizens of those countries. That's in the European Union. Never mind looking what's happening in other countries with nationals, never mind with migrants. And what happens to the kind of treatment we see in the Middle East for many migrants from Asia and Africa. I could go on, but I think the final point is, I don't think the implementation of the compact, even as it is, and for some of the beneficial points it has, by articulating in a non-binding way what some of those obligations are, is going forward very far, very fast.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. And within that context, I mean, the context of a very weak or non-existent international framework or regulations altogether beyond the Global Compact, I mean, in general, there are two issues which probably belong to that deficit at the multilateral level. The first one is that migrants are not represented as an entity at the global level. Nobody talks on behalf of the migrants, workers. And the second one is that the bilateral agreements, such as the one between Switzerland and Philippines that you mentioned as an example, apparently are much more efficient than any sort of multilateral agreement or mechanism that is not yet in place anyway. Do you think this complements more or less the deficit of the multilateral framework?
Well, Manuela, actually, my understanding, based on working on the standards and the framework over the last 30 years, is that there is a very precise and very articulate international normative framework applying to migrants and migration. You have three instruments: the ILO Convention 97 on migration for employment, ILO Convention 143 on supplemental provisions, and you have the United Nations International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families. And the first thing I'd like to note is that I think now 90 countries have ratified at least one of those three instruments. And if you include the signatories of the International Convention, signatory being non-fully binding, but generally as a prerequisite step to ratification, committing the state to respecting the principles of the convention that it intends to ratify. You have over 100 countries that have essentially committed themselves legally to respecting and implementing and domesticating in national legislation the principles of those instruments. That's not so bad. And I like to make the comparison in this context with the discussion that with 55 ratifications, somehow the International Convention on the Protection of Rights of all migrant workers and members of their families is only ratified by some countries, and it's not an important instrument. And then I look at ILO Convention 102, the global reference on social protection, which has 58 ratifications. Now, how interesting to me that there is such a selective analysis that one convention that everybody recognizes and is in everybody's interest as a global reference for social protection for all, and was of course the reference for determining a social protection floor resolution, both a recommendation at ILO and a resolution at the UN General Assembly, is seen as essentially a universal instrument, even though it doesn't have all that many ratifications, because a whole number of countries are reluctant to ratify it because they don't have yet the means to necessarily put in place and cover the entire population with all 9 basic grounds of Social Security. Whereas, and in many terms that are similar and overlapping, this convention is ratified by almost as many countries, and a number of other countries, including Italy, that refused to ratify it, have used it as a standard for developing national legislation. So I think there, one of the underlying points I would make that comes back to my starting point when we talk about solidarity and international community is that we do have a framework, but there are a lot of powerful economic interests that would rather not have that framework and rather not be accountable. Because if you can pay migrant workers 20% or 30% less pay for doing that agricultural work, then you'd have to pay a national. And if you don't have to have your basic occupational safety and health protections in place because they cost, and you know that migrant workers, even regular, let alone in irregular status, have great difficulty forming unions, coming back to your other question, exercising freedom of association, whether it's at a local or international level, and expressing and pressing through collective bargaining that they get what they're entitled to. You have a lot of interest in a lot of people, even to the extent where you have a whole number of legal cases in the US, where meat packers who couldn't get local workers would themselves simply call on the phone somebody in Tijuana or in Sonata or somewhere in northern Mexico and say, hey, we've got a big order, we need a bunch of people here. And somehow within 2 days, a busload of Mexicans and others would show up at the plant ready to work. That's become more difficult with the wall on the border. But on the other hand, those meatpacking plants weren't able to work without those workers because there weren't workers in the US to do that work. And again, I come back to that dependency. But the other point you raised that I do want to make a quick comment on is that it's true on the one hand that there isn't kind of a formal representation in the international intergovernmental system of migrant worker organizations. However, I would say huge caveat to that, because number one, a lot of trade unions around the world now, particularly in the construction, in public health, in agriculture and so on, incorporate, and in some cases are majority migrant workers or foreign-born workers. US in cleaning and maintenance services, for example. They're well represented in their national unions and in the AFL-CIO that is represented in ILO, which as a tripartite organization does have representation. And the migrant presence in trade union delegations now to the International Labour Conference is sometimes quite visible. Alongside that, you have, at least in two regions, organization of, for example, in Asia, the Migrant Forum in Asia. You had a European Migrant Forum as well that has had political and other problems, but you have had, over the period of the last number of years, attempts to, and in the case of MFA, quite successful attempts to build organizations that very much are present and are at the GA debates on migration, are very much welcomed into the International Labour Conference debates. In fact, the MFA and a number of other migrant organizations in Europe and elsewhere have been invited both to have a presence at ILC and as observer organizations, but also have been invited by the worker group to sit in on the worker group discussions so that their voices not only coming, so that migrant voices not only through migrant participation in trade unions, but migrant voices as migrant organizations and migrant-based organizations also have a presence. There's a long way to go on that, but there's also some progress that I think I'd like to underline in this discussion.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Syed Saiful is asking something which is exactly related to the issue of representation that you just mentioned in the context of these weak multilateral frameworks which are not fully implemented and respected. And so he's asking if at the multilateral level, the multilateral stakeholders like migrants, business, states, all together could really improve the policies and the mechanisms that are in place if they join forces, if there is room for that.
I would say absolutely. And I would just note for reference that Saiful Haq has been longtime executive of WARBI, which is the Bangladesh Association of Returned Migrant Workers, and has been one of the, I would say, leading figures in Asia and internationally in conveying not only a migrant voice, but in organizing migrants to be able to have a strong collective voice. And I think there's a very long way to go on that. But I will say, having been, in fact, the instigator and coordinator of the global committee that promoted and succeeded in moving the ratifications, or had a big role, I should say, in moving ratifications of the Convention on Migrant Workers from 8 ratifications to the 55 it has now, that it was in almost every country where that convention was ratified, the result of advocacy and organized advocacy by coalitions of unions, human rights groups, faith-based groups, other civil society organizations, and in some cases, even pressure from employers and employers' organizations who said, you know, we can better handle our work when we have a fair standard that doesn't allow those who don't obey the rules to present unfair competition. So I'm saying in support of that, yeah, but a lot more organizing has to happen, because at present there is a grouping of organizations that calls itself Civil Society on Migration, but I don't think it's entirely representative either of diverse views or of all of the actors, particularly in countries outside a few countries in the West and in Asia. And again, a lot more, I think, organizing at the national level to place pressure on governments, for example, in the Horn of Africa, where no country has ratified that convention. But if you go to neighboring East Africa, where you have strong trade unions in Uganda and Kenya, and a strong, if you will, progressive, well, pseudo-progressive government in Rwanda, you see that a number of countries there have ratified the convention. Similarly, across West Africa. Similarly, again here noting where some of the participants come from, what I like to note is that all of the countries in Latin America, except Panama and Venezuela, and Brazil, have ratified the Convention on Migrant Workers, and most countries in the Caribbean have also ratified it. So, and again, in those countries, it was a combination of progressive governments, but also mobilization by social forces, particularly the unions, particularly socially engaged civil society organizations and faith-based groups that made the difference.
Yes, Patrick, and since you are mentioning it...
And I guess I would just jump in and add, Manuela, that I think there's, that I can come back and finally say that that's also the basis of the organization whose logo you see behind us, was trying to put together a group of experts in different regions to provide some of the knowledge base to support civil society and trade union organizing and support changing and instigating more rights-based and responsible policies and legislation on the part of governments. The knowledge base, the evidence base is the necessary complement to having your values formulations in order to really say, this is the way we need to go, this is what you need to do, and this is the basis on which you organize people to make that collectively a strong position publicly.
Yes, no, you probably do not know it, Patrick, but you are talking here to a Colombian who is Enrique and to a Venezuelan who is myself. So the question raised by Enrique on the Venezuelan migrants, not only in Colombia, but all over Latin America that are literally starving now, is particularly sensitive to both of us, as you can imagine. So maybe you would like to add something on that specific case, specific but relevant in terms of the region itself, the whole Latin American region affected by that migrant flows.
Very good question, and I think very pertinent, but I will take it into a bigger context. And that is to say that in part, the massive exodus of migrants and refugees from Venezuela over the last 2 or 3 years is not isolated from political, diplomatic, and economic pressures that have been placed from outside on Venezuela in particular to try to isolate a government that some of the world powers, particularly the uncle to the north, are not happy about. And I think the question of the relationship between forced mobility and sanctions and international political struggles is not off of the agenda of what I'm talking about. Because when we come back to the question of solidarity, first of all, I would say solidarity starts at home. Second, when we talk internationally, it's a question of a challenge. Now, I know from having been a number of times in Colombia, not so much recently, but continuing to follow the discussion around the challenges that local communities, particularly in the eastern part of Colombia, are facing, who, on the one hand, quite naturally initially welcome people because whatever their situation is or whatever the motivations, they're people who need solidarity. The challenge comes when the international community, on the one hand, or certain actors in the international community make conditions worse that provoke people to leave, and at the same time don't provide the adequate resources for the community where those people arrive to be able to survive and provide support for refugees. And I think this has been a problem universally in Colombia now, and also in Ecuador and Peru and in Brazil, where large influxes overwhelm local communities, but the state and the international community is not providing the sufficient resources to ensure that both the people in place and the refugees arriving or the migrants arriving at least have decent basic living conditions, food, nourishment, housing, etc., and ultimately have the possibility of some kind of meaningful work, because no one wants to be in a situation where they live for years and decades in camps.
Yes. Thank you, Patrick, for this, for generalizing a specific case, but indeed there are common features, even if it is a specific circumstance right now. I have a political question myself, if I may, political in the sense that it lies on the responsibility of policymakers and how they communicate the issues of migration. I'm thinking particularly about European countries, but not only. And is the following: in your introduction, you highlighted the economic dependence on developed economies on migrant workers, which is indeed absolutely is a fact, and we have figures and we have trends. I mean, you can really document it from an informative point of view. However, this topic of this dependency is, particularly in the European and also the US press, not highlighted in connection with the nationalistic, even populist policymakers' positions that are totally disconnected from that dependency. I mean, the connection is never made clear for the public opinion at large. So it's very easy for a populist policymaker to say, as you said, migrants are the scapegoat for this and this and that. So how to improve that message to educate the public opinion, the voters, the policymakers themselves, to really raise the awareness on the dependency that we have, particularly in industrialized countries, on the migrants' role, for instance, on social security, as you mentioned. What can be done about that?
I think that's, in a way, the underlying question to this whole discussion. And my starting point is to lament a singular lack of courage and clarity on the part of the actors who should know better. Scapegoating migrants, going back literally hundreds of years, has been an often used and easy way to externalize or divert attention from social problems. I grew up in a city where in the history of my high school, there is now a kind of poster on the wall where they've done a history of the city and the school, where they have images of Chinese workers in Seattle, Chinese families with their houses burning behind them, being pushed by mobs down to the port and literally thrown onto a ship because the Chinese were the cause of the problems for the post-World War I depression that preceded the Great Depression, or I should say the post-World War I recession that preceded the Great Depression. And you saw that across the states. And you can go back to the anti-German riots in the east coast of the US, when Germans and then Italians were seen as threats to the emerging Anglo-Saxon American power. So there's nothing new in it, but what I think there's also, unfortunately, not a lot new in the fact that I come back to the lack of, in my view, personalizing, the lack of courage on the part of international institutions to say what's wrong is wrong and to also have an alternative. And unfortunately, I think particularly the institution that you referred to earlier, the IOM, has developed an alternative discourse that's much too utilitarian, that says not that there are ethical or moral or reasons of social coherence and cohesion and so on, and reasons of the fact that we have international standards and values that say equality, human rights, everybody should be treated and considered equally, and everybody has a part in our societies. Too much emphasize, well, we need migrants for economic reasons. And migrants, migrants are going to come here and take jobs. We need them to come here and take jobs. How the heck does that go down in rural UK or in urban London when you have hundreds of thousands of Brits who, because of age, because of technological changes, have been thrown out of industrial work because their jobs have disappeared? And how does that go down elsewhere when people are seeing unemployment rising as a result of structural problems and also political challenges? Why did people vote Brexit? Because yes, migrants were made the issue, but part of the issue was, at least as far as I can see, that there were a lot of people who were hurting, and migration and the European Union and globalization were cleverly amalgamated with the problems they were facing rather than distinguished. And that the real problems of why Europe needs migrants is a question of demographics, but it's also a question of technological change. It's also a question of structural means of reducing work to simple work and then exporting as much of it, the labor-intensive work, as you can elsewhere, without any attempt to retrain retrenched workers or to provide alternative employment in decent conditions. And when I say that, it's because you can't tell people who've had highly skilled auto working or steel working or even coal mining jobs that, well, your jobs are done, and if you want to work, well, there's a McDonald's, there's flipping hamburgers at a McDonald's. So, there are a whole bunch of more complex problems behind there that I think enter into the question you were raising and enter into, I think, a situation where those of us who might say we want a rights-based approach haven't yet been able to consolidate around an accurate, appropriate discourse that also says you can't separate the economic from the ethical principles of what will make, in a globalized world, a society remain socially cohesive when it has to become multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial. Because, to put it rather bluntly, in some of the countries that have a national identity as white Christian Western, there aren't enough white Christian Westerner workers to do all the work that needs to be done. And somehow, rather than polarizing, which has an effective side impact, that if you can keep those people in their place, you can justify continuing to mistreat them. You can say we don't want them, but we need them. And so you just say, okay, well, they can come in, but we're not going to give them protection, equality of treatment, because we don't really want to recognize that our society itself is changing. And that's hard for people to recognize when they see their society changing and them being left behind. And then on top of that, the Sustainable Development Agenda basically saying leave no one behind. It ain't only poor people in the South that are left behind, and migration, unfortunately, provides a much too easy scapegoat to not face the music and not fix the things that need to be fixed. And as I come back in full circle to what we said, the problems are not just what's happening, but what will be the consequences of what's happening over the next months and years, particularly around migration. And I would simply add to that, to bring us right to the present, that at another level, migrants and the treatment of migrants have replaced, substituted for, or moved beyond the racialized stratification of populations in Western countries and industrialized countries. And when one looks at the way migrants are characterized and who is seen as a migrant, in the US, where I come from, you see a strong amalgamation between, well, the same things that used to be said about blacks, that they're lazy, they don't work, they're criminal, they're rapists or whatever, they're a threat to our society, they're etc., are the same characterizations that you see from the hard right. And it's very easy to do because a lot of those migrants are, in fact, you know, to put it in simplified terms, black and brown people. And when you look at the mortality rates of blacks and you look at who black workers are in the US, a lot of them today are not just the descendants of people who were brought over in chains, but there are quite a number of them, and I referred earlier to Somalians being very prominent in health work in the UK. Migration from Africa over the last 20 or 30 years to the US has also brought quite a few people. And no accident that you have, on the one hand, amalgamations, and on the other hand, now, because of those amalgamations and the fact that a lot of people are being treated with the same, with the similar characterization and the similar hostility and the similar mortality. What surprised me, I think, was also that a lot of young white people in the US, a lot of young white people were on those demonstrations. It wasn't just, as it's sometimes been in the past, the most directly affected communities. It's people saying, well, this actually applies to all of us. And what we need to reform isn't just the treatment of police by one particular ethnic or color group, but it's a question more generally of how our society is organized, what our social values are, and how they're expressed through government, and how the executives of countries may be increasingly on a different direction and in a different place than what's needed to solve some of the huge, very difficult to solve problems that we see in industrialized countries and now worldwide, deepened or made worse by the COVID pandemic and the responses to or non-responses to the COVID pandemic.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Precisely on that issue, Don had a question if this characterization is only a UK phenomenon or is it happening elsewhere? And somehow you mentioned it. Maybe you would like to say something more on that?
Actually, yes, please, I would like to say, because if one looks now at what's happening worldwide, the characterization and the malignment of migrants is truly a global phenomenon. One has only to cite some of the most dramatic instances that I already did of what's happening to migrant workers from Asia and Africa and the Middle East. But one can go back now to 2 waves in South Africa over the last 6 or 7 years, in each of which more than 100 migrants from other places in Africa have been killed in deadly violence. And where, for example, in Durban, whole blocks of Somali and Ethiopian and other East African owned businesses were burned. And at one point, I remember reading that they actually, I can't remember whether it was in Durban or Pretoria, but in one of the big cities, the government actually had to set up kind of a displaced persons camps because thousands of people who were of other African origins were being targeted, of course, for the lack of solution to the huge economic problems and the huge marginalization of the Black majority that are the legacy of apartheid, but have not been solved or even significantly reduced in the post-apartheid era. So again, it's universal, but I think one can look also in Asian countries at the treatment of Indonesian migrants in Malaysia, to give another example. One can also see, to come to another region, the huge difficulties, the marginalization, the even physical attacks on Peruvians, particularly Peruvian women in Argentina. Just again, to name a few examples. And coming back to your earlier question, Manuela, I think it's not entirely unrelated to the challenges of scapegoating and seeing Venezuelans now as the problem or the threat in the countries where, because of circumstances far beyond their control, they've been forced to pick up everything and cross borders. So yes, Dawn, I think it's a pretty universal phenomenon, and I think it's not entirely unrelated to the increasing organization and communication by forces on the right, economic as well as political, that similarly have benefited from the super exploitation of Mozambican workers in South African agriculture, or closer to what I've been working with, the abysmal conditions of those Ethiopian workers in Sudanese farms that I referred to. But I mean, you go back to another example, the treatment of Tajik and Kyrgyz farm workers in Kazakhstan, where en masse the population has never had documentations, and where they're routinely picked up, shaken down by authorities. And at the same time, when you read and listen to the official discourse, they practically don't exist, as has been the case with Roma populations and others in Europe for a long time. But it's also, I think, to suggest on the alternative that there's a sense of looking at this holistically. And Dawn, just for others on the call, I can mention, has been founder and organizer of the Migrants' Rights Organization in the UK, and worked for many years for one of the large immigrant and migrant services organizations in the UK. So someone also who's been part of this and whose questions come very much from being very much on the front lines of this.
Thank you so much. This was extremely informative and a very rich discussion. I think I will give the floor to Alejandro to thank you again, and hoping to have you on board in the great talks in the future. Alejandro, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Patrick. This was as always a very interesting presentation and challenging, because I think we could spend hours developing the issues. I particularly like very much the whole development and the rationale of your presentation, and particularly the ending, because at the ending you touch the moral and the ethical issues, because we tend to consider migrants as a factor of production, as if they were not people. And I feel that in some cases, the issue is not that they are rightly considered as a factor of production, but that they are people, and people that you might not have the right language, might not have the right color, might not have the right accent, might not have the right religion, might not have the right gender. So there are so many things with migrants, might not have the right age. Older migrants have different problems. Women migrants have different problems. And the children of migrants, they grew in a very challenging environment. So it's a very critical issue, and it really reflects the values and the functioning of society. So thank you very much for bringing all these in very interesting subjects. I'm sure this great talk will be shared many times, and hopefully we will have you in another great talk to see what at the end of the confinement period and hopefully the new developments that will arise from this learning period that we're having worldwide will have an impact on migrants and all of us. Thank you very much again. to you, Patrick. Lots of success. I know you have been participating almost on a daily basis on different talks. And thank you very much to all the participants that joined us today. Thank you. Goodbye.